And before we begin, Professor, do you mind pronouncing your name for me?
Yeah, Gilles Carbonnier.
Gilles Carbonnier.
Very nice.
Beautiful, thank you.
Okay, we're ready to go. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening for some of you, I think, and good morning for others, depending on where you're joining us from. We're really pleased to have all of you with us for today's conversation about humanitarian action, policy, and diplomacy in the midst of contemporary warfare. Guiding us through that conversation is someone with just the perfect background to do this, and that's Dr. Gilles Carbonnier, who is currently the Vice President of the International Committee for the Red Cross. Our moderator in just a second will do a formal introduction, but I just want to welcome our guest and thank him for sharing time with us right before he's headed out to, it sounds like, a field mission as soon as tomorrow. So we're grateful that you're taking time with us. I just want to highlight, since those of you on the call would be very interested in this topic, that if you should find yourselves in Geneva, I highly recommend the museum that's in the building where our guest is speaking from. The ICRC museum is truly wonderful. It's probably a couple floors below where our guest is in the basement. I did it, several decades ago, and it was already an excellent exhibit, but I guess a few years ago they must have redone it because I did it 2 years ago. It is absolutely outstanding. The only word of caution I will give you is whatever the guidebooks say is the amount of time you should devote to the museum. If you're like me and really want to study this stuff, you need to at least double that amount of time or triple it, because there's a great, it really goes over all of the different areas of the work, and so I highly recommend it. Plus, it's just a beautiful location up on the hill above the Palais des Nations, so I highly recommend it the next time you're in Geneva. Definitely worth half a day. So my job right now is to turn it over to our moderator, who is a student of ours, Nandini Jani, and I'm very pleased to have her filling this role. She was nominated by a member of our faculty to do this, given her interest in humanitarian issues, human rights. Nandini is a key member of our Student Leadership Institute, the Buccino Leadership Institute. She's also a member or a participant in our Diplo Lab, which is a research initiative for undergraduate students run by one of our professors that does policy relevant research and then publishes it. She's done a couple of very impressive internships, but what I just think is like this pure perfect coincidence. One of the things outside of Seton Hall that Nandini has done is she is the Bergen County Youth Council President for the American Red Cross. And I just love that. Talk about just a perfect coincidence. Maybe the professor knew that when they nominated you, Nandini, but when I saw that, I was just like, wow, that's just like a full circle moment. So Nandini's going to moderate and guide us through our conversation with Mr. Carbonnier. And so I'll turn it over to you, Nandini. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Smith. Good afternoon, everyone. Without further ado, I'd like you to join me all in welcoming Dr. Gilles Carbonnier. Dr. Carbonnier is a trailblazer in the field of development economics, humanitarian action, and international trade. Since 2007, he has been a professor of development economics at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. His expertise is in international cooperation, the economic dynamics of armed conflict, and the nexus between natural resources and development. Prior to joining the Institute, Dr. Carbonnier spent several years in the field with the International Committee of the Red Cross, as head of a subdelegation in Ethiopia and Iraq, as a delegate in Sri Lanka and El Salvador, and then as an economic advisor at the ICRC headquarters. Currently, Dr. Carbonnier serves as the Vice President of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Carbonnier. Is there anything you would like to add about your professional journey before we begin?
No, Nandini, thank you very much for these very kind words of introduction. I would just like to say how pleased I am to interact with students of the School of Diplomacy and International Relations, and very glad also to have this chance to interact. And thanks also to Dean Courtney-Smith for his words of introduction, and I very much look forward to the conversation after our exchange.
We're thrilled to have you. Let's get started. The Red Cross emblem is recognized all over the world as a symbol of hope. Can you tell us a bit about the International Committee of the Red Cross and what makes this organization different from other humanitarian organizations?
Well, there are a few specific features of my organization, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I would like to go straight into the museum, the International Museum of the Red Cross and Red Crescent that Dean Smith was just alluded to. When you get there, you see the founder of the Red Cross, Mr. Henri Dunant, writing his souvenir of Solferino. And actually, if you want to understand the specificity of my organization, I think you can trace it back to two quite great ideas that Henri Dunant had 162 years ago, actually. He was a businessman and had some issues with his business. And to settle these issues and with his investment, he wanted to see and discuss with Napoleon III. Well, Napoleon III was waging a war against the Austrians in northern Italy. So, Henri Dunant went there and he got into a small village called Solferino on the morning after a terrible battle that left 40,000 soldiers on both sides dead and injured on the battlefield. So when he saw that, and he saw that there were no medical care provided to anyone, he organized first aid, he organized medical services, and he requested be provided to both French and Austrians, whether friends or enemies. And I think this first idea that he came with, which is to establish medical care services that are respected by all parties to the conflict as neutral humanitarian intermediaries. So he decided to select the Red Cross, which is actually the reverse of the Swiss flag, as the emblem that should be respected by everyone. And 4 years later, he created with four other personalities the Red Cross, or the International Committee of the Red Cross, that then became the international movement that I will refer to in a minute. And the second idea was that a year after founding the Red Cross, in 1864, he convened an international diplomatic conference in Geneva, asking the states and the powers of the time to agree and sign the first Geneva Convention on the protection and care for the wounded on the battlefield. And this is the birth of international humanitarian law. This is the birth of the laws of armed conflict that seek to preserve a minimum of humanity in the worst of situations, in the midst of armed conflicts. So, Nandini, you see, on that basis, I think there are four specific features of my organization. First, it's a private organization under Swiss law. But at the same time, it has a mandate under international law. Under the Geneva Conventions, 196 states have entrusted us with the role to serve as custodian of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocols of 1977. So we have a mandate to promote international humanitarian law, which is the law that applies in armed conflicts. And this law rests on three principles. First, distinction between military objectives and military personnel on one hand, and civilian objects and civilians who must be protected, spared, and respected. And the combatants who are put out of combat, injured, or prisoners must be treated humanly. Second principle, precaution. Take all the necessary precaution when using specific means and methods of warfare to be able to protect and spare civilians as well as people put out of combat. And thirdly, the third principle is proportionality, meaning using means and methods of warfare that are proportional in relation to the threat and in relation to the military advantage that is pursued. So you see, in practice, what we do at the ICRC is to promote IHL, International Humanitarian Law, all the way from assisting states to adopt national laws and regulations, to ensuring that it is embedded in training manual, in training programs of armed forces, also police forces when it comes to law enforcement. So we engage actually diplomatically all the way from the UN Security Council to frontline negotiations with arms carriers in the field. The second specificity is that many international organizations focus on a specific sector, food or health or sanitation, or they focus on a specific target group, say children. My organization focuses on the needs of people affected by armed conflict writ large according to their priority needs. So we try to provide a multidisciplinary humanitarian response to best address their needs, be it food, cash assistance, medical assistance, income generating activities, wastewater treatment, medical assistance, prosthetic or physical rehabilitation services for victims of landmines, amputees, etc. A third specificity is that a lot of what we do is not pure assistance, but it's geared at protecting people in armed conflict. For example, by searching for the missing and restoring family links, and also registering and visiting prisoners in detention places to ascertain their conditions of detention and ensure human treatment. And finally, maybe the fourth specificity about my organization is to act as a neutral intermediary in war, for instance, to facilitate the release of prisoners once the warring parties have agreed. For example, last October, we facilitated the return of over 1,000 detainees in relation to the conflict in Yemen. And actually, this operation was the outcome of 2 years of talks, building on the Stockholm Agreement of 2018. And we do remain confidence-building measures that involve all the conflict parties can contribute to further progresses towards a lasting political solution in Yemen. And we also arrange, for instance, as a neutral intermediary, the dignified restitution of human remains and dead bodies to families who have lost their loved in Nagorno-Karabakh, across line. To all of this, we have about 20,000 staff and a budget now of $2.2 billion. We operate in 90 countries, but of course our major operations are in countries like Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria. And finally, we are part of a larger family, the International Movement of the Red Cross, with the International Federation of the Red Cross, and with 192 national societies, such as the American Red Cross, where you operate also, Nandini, as a volunteer. So together, we operate in the delivery of humanitarian assistance, while we can leverage the vast network of volunteers that are really anchored, embedded in their own communities across the globe. So I think with this, you have an idea of the specificity of the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Excellent. And that's very impressive that the organization works with so many different departments, different community partners to achieve all of its goals. Very impressive. So you mentioned that the International Committee of the Red Cross was forged in the battlefield almost 150 years ago, but the world is a very different place today. So can you give us a sense of some of the challenges facing humanitarian organizations today?
Well, the challenges are many, but maybe for the sake of time, let me focus on 3 challenges of contemporary warfare for us. The protracted nature of conflict, the fragmented nature of parties to the conflict, and the fact that war is ever more happening in urban centers and urban settings. So first, as you all know, many countries have been gripped by protracted, intractable conflicts, in which children have grown up actually knowing just that situation of war and violence. Think of Syria, where we are about, very sadly, to see the conflicts turning 10. And we see that after 10 years, violence goes unabated. The economic collapse of the country is having very dramatic humanitarian consequences, and not least the continued deterioration of critical vital infrastructure and services. Afghanistan is another case in point where we, the ICRC, we have been delivering humanitarian assistance for 33 years. Iraq, now it's 40 years. And just to give you a personal experience, as you kindly mentioned, I was working in 1991 in Iraq. And I returned back last year and met in Erbil a former colleague, Iraqi colleague, with whom as young professionals we had worked there together. And he told me, you know, I'm now a grandfather. Now my grandchildren have been living a normal life in the midst of conflict, sanctions, and so forth. And fortunately, he told me, you, the ICRC and others, you have adapted your humanitarian response. While in 1991, we had provided bulk food, today we try, for instance, in Mosul, to provide livelihood support through microeconomic initiatives, through income-generating activities, with an idea to lift as quickly as possible people out of aid dependency, knowing that it's 40 years that we have been. And sometimes our discussion with our donors are quite vivid, because of course, when we start to do that, we know that we do that for purely humanitarian reason, to safeguard the dignity of the human dignity of the population. But some might say, well, why do you as an emergency organization engage in restoring a large water pumping station in Mosul, in providing income generating activities? And we think this is at the heart of our mandate, even if we are not a development organization. So you see, it raises a lot of questions on the nexus between humanitarian development, peace, and today even climate issues. The second challenge I mentioned is the fragmentation of armed conflict, because we see a multiplication of non-state armed groups. In a recent study, we have identified 614 non-state armed groups that are relevant in our context of operations. And actually, we have engaged dialogue and contacts with about 2/3 of them. But we witness very fluid and fragmented chains of command. And I tell you that getting security guarantees for our operation and our staff is a daily challenge, because you have to know that we do not work under armed escort. We always seek to get the acceptance, or at least to be tolerated by all the parties to the conflict, so that we can operate on the ground without any hard security, without any armed escort as we move around. So securing access is of the essence if we want to protect an estimated 66 million people living under the de facto rule of non-state armed groups. And finally, the privatization and criminalization of conflict is also worrying. We see endemic violence linked to gangs and organized crime, which is driving displacement and gender-based violence. And I think Central America is a case in point. So quickly, the third challenge that I mentioned is war in cities. Think of Tripoli, Aden, Aleppo, Donetsk, Mosul. The use of heavy explosives with a wide-ranging impact renders the protection of civilians very challenging, and actually it is often virtually impossible to spare civilian facilities, to spare children, women, and elderly, using heavy explosives with wide-ranging area impact in densely populated areas. So all these challenges are compounded today by counterterrorism policies and measures that end up often restricting the capacity of humanitarian organizations to operate in sanctioned jurisdiction. In spite of humanitarian exemptions and carved out in sanctioned regimes that we have negotiated, that states have granted us, we see that de-risking by banks, or the so-called chilling effect of sanction on commercial actors, actually undermines our capacity to muster the logistical and financial services required to run our operations. And overall, we consider that armed conflicts today are compounded by climate change and COVID-19. Climate change fuels competition over scarce resources. For instance, we see this across the Sahel, where climate change is pitting farmers against pastoralists over scarce grazing land. And the pandemic has been stretching medical and social welfare systems, I think, to the limit, which exacerbates tensions and inequities in fragile conflict environment. So we have seen a big increase in forcibly displaced people, nowadays over 80 million people. And not surprisingly, the humanitarian sector has more than doubled its overall size in the last 10 years. We, the ICRC, our own budget has doubled over the last 10 years to try to meet rising needs. So in a nutshell, these are the challenges, and I can say a bit more about how we try to address these challenges.
So what are some of the techniques states can use to better mobilize their domestic financial resources to combat these challenges?
Well, it's a really a good question, because indeed, in some instances, war affects middle-income countries where states have the capacity to muster domestic resources to a certain. For instance, medical assistance or cattle, by extending veterinary services to go in fragile, potentially risky areas where the state services cannot actually operate. We always seek to encourage states to provide essential services to the population to the extent that they have the ability and means to do so. And we also mobilize donors, international partners for that sake. So if you look at our biggest operation today, Syria was a middle-income country, but the Syrian GDP has been divided by at least 3. And remember, Syria lost more than 25 years of progresses along the Human Development Index in just the first few years of conflict. So today, with economic collapse, hyperinflation, the situation is extremely dire in terms of resources available. We work also in Yemen, South Sudan, Iraq, Nigeria as major areas of operations. And actually, we see in Africa and the Middle East, especially across, all the way from Western Sahara, across the Sahel, the Lake Chad region, up to the Horn of Africa, a large region of instability where we have scaled up significantly our response. Lately, in response to the crisis in Tigre, northern Ethiopia, where over 55,000 people have now fled across the border into Sudan. In the Middle East, as I mentioned, our primary focus remains related to Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. And I think that there is no humanitarian solutions to the very large humanitarian crisis we have seen over the years evolving in Syria and Yemen. So actually, it's only through a political settlement, a political solution, that such a complex humanitarian crisis can be addressed.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then, as you've mentioned, the ICRC works globally. But can you outline some of the most pressing humanitarian emergencies that you're focusing most of your attention on?
Yeah, well, I outlined quite a number of contexts. As I mentioned, Syria, Yemen. There are other contexts which are very much underfunded, and it's an issue because, as you know, one of the main principles of humanitarian organization is impartiality. And impartiality means that we will seek to assist as a matter of priority those people who have the most urgent and intense needs. But in reality, what we see is that in some contexts, our appeals are overfunded, and in other contexts today, our appeal remain largely underfunded. It's the case today in South Sudan, in Libya, and in other contexts where we are quite worried to see ongoing humanitarian emergencies being somehow neglected. So we do work with our major partners and donors in order to fill such gaps. We see also a number, I would say, a trend which is quite, I would say, quite alarming in a destabilization on the Eastern Africa, especially with the situation evolving in northern Mozambique, Cabo Delgado region, where we have a mix of, I would say, violent economic crime and violence related to Islamist groups being active in the region. And this is quite difficult to handle in terms of managing security. You have the conjunction of politically motivated, grievance-motivated violence with the conjunction of economically motivated violence. And I think this needs constant attention. And maybe the last point is also the emergence or re-emergence of private military and security companies that we see having quite an influence in different contexts.
Excellent. Thank you for elaborating on the most dominating challenges in the field and across the world. I'd like to shift gears now towards humanitarian law. The organization's core mandate involves promoting respect for international humanitarian law, as it is the law of war. Can you explain some of the dynamics at play that are undermining respect for humanitarian law in contemporary conflicts?
Well, Nandini, you're right. The dominant narrative nowadays is very much about, does international law and international humanitarian law in particular work? And I would like first to say that it very often works in practice. IHL often save lives, alleviate sufferings, and our team in the field, they see daily ambulances being authorized to move across checkpoints to bring injured people, be they enemies, to hospital for treatment. And every day we see military commanders taking decision not to target or not to hit a specific place in order to spare civilians. We have invited academics and students, universities, to co-create a database which is entitled IHL in Action, where students actually document such positive cases in order to draw lessons on what works and also to help us counter a dominant narrative that only focuses on failures, which of course risks dismissing the merit and value of the Geneva Conventions. That said, I don't want to sound overly optimistic. We see a sadly egregious violation of IHL much too often, be it extra killings, the disappearance of detainees, the use of explosive weapons in urban centers hitting civilians, as I mentioned. Let me focus a bit on instances of systematic attacks on healthcare facilities and health personnel. We have recorded between over 1,200 acts of violence on health staff and healthcare facilities. And in Syria, more than half of public hospitals and healthcare centers have been partially or fully shut down. Some of them, they have been hit by several airstrikes. So years ago, we have launched a global initiative entitled Healthcare in Danger, with the aim to protect the medical mission. This initiative focuses on revising military doctrine and practice, on developing national legislation, but also on training and supporting directly healthcare personnel, on prevention, on preparedness. As a practical example also of concrete measures that we put in place in order to implement IHL with non-state actors. In 2018, after 4 years of intensive consultation with weapon bearers, our team in Lebanon managed to persuade 20 to sign a commitment to protect healthcare, which resulted in much better access for the refugees to the hospital care. So you see that there are ways and means to try to counter the fact that indeed egregious violations happen every day, and we have to better understand how we can intervene, all the way from engaging states on laws, legislation, and to training manuals and actually training programs and practical discussions and engagement on the field.
Yes, of course. And what role, if at all, do illicit financial flows play in hindering this progress?
So your question, I think, refers back to the question you were asking first about how to improve or how to help mobilize domestic resources in fragile contexts. And it is not the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross to mingle or intervene on these issues. But of course, when we work, for instance, with detention authorities to make sure that people in detention places receive adequate food and medical care, there is an issue that states have to be able to mobilize the resources to be allocated to the prison system. And of course, if you read the literature on development economics about the phenomenon of illicit financial flows which erode the tax base of countries, especially the tax base of countries with weak institutions, you can infer from that it is important to also see how to prevent such tax base erosion, so that countries with even with weak institutions are able to mobilize the necessary resources for vital essential services.
Thank you so much for that clarification and distinction. Would you mind sharing some practical examples of how you engage with state and non-state actors?
There is a variety of action that we take to influence actually the behavior of belligerents to reduce the harm inflicted on civilians and on arms carriers who do not anymore participate in hostilities. And actually this, we believe, contributes to reduce grievances, contributes also to break away from spirals of violence and or environment for peace talks. We are working with over 130 armed forces around the world to promote best practices in armed forces doctrine, ground rules, training, and practice. For instance, last month, just to give you fresh examples, we conducted IHL seminars for junior officers of the Nigerian Defense Intelligence Agency. We conducted orientation sessions for the Serbian military police, pre-deployment briefing to members of the Indonesian armed forces serving in peacekeeping missions in the Central African Republic and Lebanon. So we routinely participate also in major national or regional military exercises to factor IHL into practical on-the-ground exercises. Importantly, international humanitarian law applies directly to non-state armed groups participating in hostilities. So we do engage in disseminating the principle of IHL, but also to secure safe access to population in need or to access detention facilities and the search for missing people. I think it is paramount to engage directly with all parties to armed conflict, but we have to go beyond that. We see more and more cases of non-international armed conflict, which are internationalized, with foreign powers supporting directly or indirectly one or the other party to the conflict. So in this sense, it is critical also for us to engage all those states that can wield a positive influence on parties to the conflict in terms of respecting IHL. It is critical also to ensure that the norms embedded in the Geneva Conventions resonate with diverse cultural and religious tradition. So we have engaged with diversity of academic and religious circles. Let me give you an example. We have worked with Muslim scholars to highlight the parallels between fundamental principles of IHL and norms under Islamic law. Last month, our colleagues in Iraq, they conducted the 8th online session on protection of medical mission under international law and Islamic law, with about 120 Muslim scholars from different parts of the country. We have done the same in Asia with influential Buddhist clerics, and we do the same in other parts of the world, because I think it is critical in disseminating and implementing international humanitarian law to have this capability to embed these norms in their universality, but also how they resonate with cultural environment. Maybe one more point I'd like to add. My own organization is also working since many years to clarify the fate of missing people in armed conflicts. Because families will never cease to search for news of their loved ones, even many years or decades after the hostilities have ended. So we keep promoting forensic work, for instance, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where still 7,000 people are unaccounted for since the mid-1990s. Another and certainly more recent example, since last December, my colleagues have provided refugees from Tigre who fled to Sudan free telephone call services to restore family links. And in the last just 2 months, they facilitated more than 13,000 phone calls across different locations so that they were able to reconnect with their families after being separated because of the conflict. And the last point is how we engage states on implementing IHL. I think we are increasingly involved in legal, policy, and operational dialogues on finding an acceptable balance between, on the one hand, legitimate security concerns of states, and on the other hand, the need to preserve our common humanity. And this is quite relevant when it comes to counterterrorism and security necessity versus ensuring the effective protection of people, of civilians under IHL. So I hope this gives you a bit of an outlook on the different ways and means which we put forth to engage, especially states, on international humanitarian law.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor. Your work about restoring family links is incredible. I think it's a point that's often overlooked, and it's amazing that it's something that this organization focuses on so heavily. Amazing work. You've given us a sense on how important it is for the ICRC to partner and engage with a wide range of actors to ensure respect for IHL and secure humanitarian access. Can you elaborate further on how you work with the US government on a diplomatic and policy level?
Well, the US government. First, I shall say that the US is our biggest donor, and I think that we are sincerely very grateful for this generosity. We have also built a robust dialogue on international humanitarian law, on military and security issues, and on specific operational contexts. Just like with any other country signatory to the Geneva Conventions, we engage with the US government in a bilateral and confidential dialogue. This is our standard modus operandi. And the ICRC president and staff engage with the US government at all levels around the world, especially with the executive branch, but also with the legislative. I might add that since 2002, we, the ICRC, we have visited people held at Guantanamo Bay, talking to detainees, advising and making recommendations on conditions of detention, and also maintaining detainees' family contacts. Like with any other government, again, our bilateral dialogue on these issues with the US is confidential and is very much maintained throughout all these years. We also maintain an intense operational dialogue focusing on the conduct of hostilities, on IHL, or on so-called partnered operations, where the US is working with or through partners in a given armed conflict. We seek to offer practical ways to engage with such partners on respecting IHL, for instance, when it comes to support in military training programs. Another critical area for dialogue that we develop is around new technologies. We focus on the humanitarian, the legal, and the ethical challenges related to emerging means and methods of warfare, for example, cyber attacks or autonomous weapon systems. Some of our key concerns revolve around the notion of retaining an element of human control over decisions to select a target and to attack, about issues of accountability, and around issues of the precision and reliability of new weapons, always in relation to the three fundamental principles underlying international humanitarian law. And currently, we certainly look forward to developing our dialogue with the new US administration, for example, on the possibility of the US acceding to certain IHL treaties, be it the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention or the Convention on Cluster Munitions. We are also certainly looking forward to further exchanges on the humanitarian impact of urban violence, where I think Central America is a case in point and quite relevant as the new administration develops a strategy for the region. We have also engaged with the US on specific humanitarian needs and protection concerns in relationship to migrants. So to conclude, Nandini, as you see, it's a broad and dense relationship that we enjoy with the US. And I would like to maybe conclude with a word on climate change and COVID-19. Actually, over half of the countries that are most vulnerable to climate risks are also impacted today by armed conflicts. So the convergence of climate risk and conflict aggravates food insecurity, economic insecurity. It weakens access to essential services. And we are very much eager to continue and deepen our work with the US government to strengthen, for instance, climate finance schemes to reduce risks for the most vulnerable, to reduce risks in fragile contexts. We also stand ready to work with the US and others on the global COVID-19 vaccine deployment to ensure equitable distribution. Actually, people living in conflict zone and in hard-to-reach areas should not be forgotten nor left aside. We have heard again and again a simple truth is that no one will be safe until we all are. And if we don't do that, we will keep seeing new variants of the virus emerging. So the ICRC, we stand certainly ready to push for vaccination across front lines in hard-to-reach areas and to intensify routine vaccination that must not be forgotten next to rolling out COVID-19 vaccination. So I think these are two emergency or urgent matters that are very high on the agenda. And I just wanted to conclude with a word on both climate change and the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Carbonnier. Dean Halpin, are we all set to open up questions to the audience?
Yes, in fact, we have a few in the chat already. So I'll just say to everyone, you can feel free to raise your hands and we'll call on you, or you can place your questions in the chat and we'll read them out. So I will start with the first question here, which is, sorry, my email's going crazy. Okay, so which is, how effective has the protection of human rights, humanitarian legal rights in cases involving genocide by non-signatory state actors to international, multilateral, and bilateral treaties been? Do you find that the International Criminal Court has teeth in deterring violations to international crimes of this kind?
Shall I address the question one by one?
It's up to you. Would you prefer that I read them all out?
No, that's fine. I can let me start if it's okay.
Very good.
So, of course, I cannot speak for the ICC, and I will try to give you a bit, our perspective. I was mentioning before that we engage in a confidential dialogue as a purely humanitarian, independent, neutral, and impartial humanitarian organization. But this has limits, and for instance, if you go back to the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, once we saw that it was pointless to maintain a confidential dialogue with whoever was in charge, the only thing that we could do is to maintain our medical teams on the spot to save a few lives if they were able to, but they did great work. And then the next thing we did was to alert the whole world and the international community that mass killing and a genocide was happening and that this had to stop. So I just wanted to say that, of course, when it comes to situations such as what happened in 1994 in Rwanda, there are certain, limits to the fact that as a custodian of international humanitarian law, as a neutral, independent, impartial humanitarian organization, we do, and then we certainly speak up and try to mobilize the international community, not anymore just through silent diplomacy, but also through more public diplomacy. Now, of course, sanctions, the ICC, I would say each and every one has its own role and mandate, and what we interesting study on the behavior of combatants and what motivates compliance with IHL. It's a study you can find online. It's called The Roots of Restraint. And we did this study by looking at a number of armed forces as well as a number of non-state armed groups. And what we found was, I would say, halfway reassuring for us. On the one hand, yes, it is worth investing in strengthening domestic legislation, in strengthening clear instructions in doctrines, in standing operating procedures, chain of command and a system within the armed forces of sanctions for misconduct, for violations. So the formal aspect is quite important, but what we discovered is that the informal socialization of violence is also quite prominent. And we discovered through this study that actually the core identity of special forces, of certain group, is also something quite important in terms of peer pressure. And I will give you one example, which is a bit, anecdotal, but I think it speaks a bit to what I'm trying to say. We were promoting international humanitarian law to a group whose, I would say, emblem was a knife planted in a skull. And then we were saying, one basic principle is to respect dead bodies and human remains, and to ensure the restitution of the body to the family. And it's absolutely key, it's a principle. And everybody was nodding. And when we are asked to look at this informal socialization of violence, we have also to look at what is the identity of certain groups. And then we question, we say, well, in that case, as you all nod, what about your fanion, the flag that is your, what does it speak? What does it tell us about who you are? And this triggered quite an interesting conversation in terms of, okay, we understood what you said in terms of the law. Now you're asking us what kind of image, what kind of. I think we have to work more on that. Now, final point on the ICC. Yes, as I mentioned, the formal aspects of sanction is certainly quite important. There is one point, however, that I have to clarify, is that as a humanitarian organization working in the field, we had to obtain a waiver whereby we would not be obliged to testify in front of the ICC. Because in order to be able to work with thousands of colleagues in the field on a daily basis, of course, if they think and suspect that all what we do and register will end up in certain places, then on the next morning we are not able to operate anymore. So this has been, treading a fine line in terms of each of us having a specific mandate and having the necessary right approach to be able to fulfill our mission.
Thank you, Professor, for your answer, and thank you, Linda, for the question. Our next question comes from Nicole. This is, where do you see the future of humanitarian action compared to the future of development action?
Actually, if you look at where the SDGs lag behind and will be hardest to implement, it is precisely in so-called humanitarian crisis. It is in fragile, conflict-prone environments. So we tend to see ever more, multilateral development banks, development actors seeking ways and means to intervene in protracted conflict, because the old wisdom of saying, well, this country is at war, let's wait a peace deal, once peace prevails, then we will start development, doesn't hold anymore. And even in a country, we can mention Ethiopia, but there are many other countries, you have between different regions in the same country, a whole lot of different situations and crises. Some part of the country may be booming and maybe developing fast. Other parts of the country may be experiencing, so-called natural disasters because of a natural hazard. Another part of the country might be experiencing a deadly conflict. And this is how do we navigate all that when we also know that climate change has an impact over the long haul. So it means breaking away silos and looking at ways of remaining true to some of our funding principles and our capacity to operate, but finding ways to actually address the plight of communities affected over decades. And those communities don't care about whether it is aid labeled as humanitarian development or whatever. And I think we have inherited a system which administratively, institutionally, and also in terms of funding lines has been very much divided. And we have to find way, and we are working at the ICRC together with donors, with development banks, including the World Bank, on really ways to be able to operate. But of course, with always the concerns on our side is to be not only acting, but always and humanitarian actor with a license to operate on the ground. So there are some interesting conversations, and one of the stumbling block is sometimes in non-international conflicts. Most of development funding comes via the state, and when the state is a party to a non-international armed conflict, working through the state structure and apparatus might be seen as, being on one siding with one party to the conflict. So depending on the case, we have to see how we can position ourselves to find more synergies, be more impactful, and yet being careful in the way we frame partnerships and deeper exchanges.
Thank you, Professor. The next question comes from Chimdi, and it is about the Tigre region. He asks, what is your view of the humanitarian crisis in the Tigre region, and how bad is it?
Well, our view is definitely that it's bad. That's why we have stepped up. First, we remained with staff in Mekele throughout the crisis, and our first priority was to refurbish and restart medical services, and being able to get the supply and to be able to restart from then Mekele, expanding to outside the capital of the province to other towns and locations. Now we see massive movements of populations with refugee influx in neighboring Sudan, and we continue to see the impact of violence in terms of humanitarian outcomes. So we have stepped up our setup and activities. We have, to tell you a bit the truth, we have already done one budgetary extension in order to really increase our response and strengthen our response, and we might even have to move to a second one, because we are still quite worried about the humanitarian situation there.
Thank you. I see we have a hand up from Jacques Chagnon.
You are on mute, Jacques, if I may say so. I don't hear.
Is that better now?
Now it's better.
Good afternoon, Elizabeth. Good afternoon, Nandini. Bonne soirée, Monsieur Carbonnier. I'm from Canada, and I know pretty well your organization. I've been close to your organization very well. Mr. Carbonnier is a little bit modest, I would say. The Croix Rouge, the Red Cross, is the most important humanitarian organization in the world. 3 times in 17, 44, and 63, that organization won the Nobel Prize of Peace. And it's well known when there's natural crisis or wars. But I wonder what's happened. We know what you do, and you told us very well what you are doing when there's a real war between 2 countries or inside a country. But what happens when a country is in a state of implosion, like, and you know very well that country, Venezuela or Haiti? How could you work between police, army, street gangs? Street gangs are not very well very attired with the Geneva Agreement. So what are you doing in those cases? And my second question, I will make it quick. How do you work in China? Well, 2 different topics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Chagnon, for this excellent question, and thank you for, in Geneva we are in a Calvinist city, so we tend not to overstate all the good thing we think about our own organization. But thank you for reminding the 3 Nobel Prizes awarded to the ICRC, plus the first Nobel Prize, which was actually awarded to Henri Dunant in 1901. So indeed, it's more for, since we are in an academic environment, it's for a little anecdote. I was the other day in Zurich, in the Polytechnical School of Zurich, and there I mentioned that we got 3 + 1 Nobel Prizes, and they said, "Oh, we have 24." So I was still humbled. I was still humbled.
Not 4 Ps.
Not 4 Ps, not a single 4 Ps. That said, on your questions, we do operate in fragile and bumpy environment. And actually, what we have learned the hard way in armed conflicts is highly relevant in order to be able to navigate extremely risky environment in the periphery of urban centers, be it in Caracas or Port-au-Prince. And to give you an example, well, of course, we work, as you mentioned very rightly, with our colleagues of the Red Cross, the Venezuelan Red Cross, and the Croix-Rouge Haitienne. And we actually, I was less than a year ago in Venezuela, or a bit over a year ago in Venezuela, where we are providing medical assistance and also livelihood assistance in Petare, which is the largest suburb in Caracas, where you don't enter if you have not negotiated your license to operate in the program there. So we do so by also engaging different actors on fundamental principles of restraint in the exercise of violence. And we finally armed escort, and we operate also in maintaining and developing a dialogue with all the actors of violence. So of course, in that case, we are in what we call an other situation of violence. It's other situation of armed violence. It's not legally speaking an armed conflict, but actually the basics of how you can operate in difficult environment like in Libya today certainly is instructive in order for us to be able to operate safely and effectively in other quite challenging environments. Then your last question on China, it's a big question, but what I would say in a nutshell is that we do engage and we have to engage even more, of course, all the P5 and emerging economies and powers. And we do engage them, of course, as members of the United Nations Security Council and emerging economies and strong economies. And we engage a bit along the same lines that I mentioned with the US government. So it's a multifaceted engagement that we have through confidential dialogue and over the long haul. And I think that we see progress, but we understand also that it's an endeavor that we have to maintain over the long haul, and sometimes be patient, and also grow an in-depth understanding of the realities and idiosyncrasies of each and every countries and relationship that we build.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Carbonnier. Bonne soirée.
Un grand plaisir.
Thank you very much. So I don't see additional questions in the chat or raised hands. Nandini, do you have any additional that you can see or that you would like to pose before we close?
No, all clear on my end. Thank you, Dean Halpin. And of course, thank you, Dr. Carbonnier, for joining the School of Diplomacy today. This was a very insightful and enlightening discussion. And I think it's time to turn it over to Dean Smith. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nandini.
Yeah, well, thank you, Nandini, for guiding the conversation, and Mr. Carbonnier for the really wonderful insights. I was trying to tease away key lessons, and there's a lot of them from here, and I know that it'll benefit our students in not only their connecting it back to their coursework, but also as they think about their future careers and how they might engage in humanitarian action and follow you in your footsteps through the various career paths that you've had very successfully. So thank you very much for that conversation. The one thing I'd like to do for the colleagues is just to highlight that we have a number of similar events coming up over the next 3 weeks. They were all in e-news on Monday. I sent out a separate email with them all yesterday. We have events on women, peace, and security, on terrorism, on the Middle East peace process, on the U.S. Foreign Service, Holocaust remembrance, and I'm probably forgetting some of them. It's a really action-packed agenda between now up through basically the week after Easter. So I'd really encourage you to join with us for any of those that you can. And if you have any trouble finding the list, you know where to reach me, and I'll be sure to get it to you. So thank you again, Mr. Carbonnier. Safe travels when you leave tomorrow. And thank you, Nandini, for a wonderful job hosting. And thanks to everyone on the session for attending, engaging in a wonderful conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Merci. Bonjour.